January 28th, 1547. A 350-pound king lies dying in his bed at Whitehall Palace. His legs, rotting with infected ulcers, leak pus onto silk sheets. The stench of decaying flesh fills the royal chamber. But this wasn't murder. This wasn't poison. This was something far more sinister, a slow, agonizing death by his own hand. Henry VIII didn't fall in battle. He ate himself to death. And if you want to survive until the end of this video, to discover the one food that killed him faster than anything else, hit that subscribe button now, because this gets darker. The year is 1530. Hampton Court Palace. The great kitchens are alive with chaos. 52 cooks work through the night, their faces red from the heat of 6 massive fireplaces. The smell of roasting flesh fills every corridor. This isn't preparation for a special occasion. This is Tuesday. Every single day, these kitchens produce over 1,000 meals. But the king's table? That's different. Henry VIII demands 13 separate dishes for every meal, twice a day. At 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, servants parade through the halls carrying platters of meat. Always meat. The numbers are staggering. In a single year, Hampton Court alone consumes 1,240 oxen, 8,200 sheep, 2,300 deer, 760 calves, 1,870 pigs, 53 wild boars. The royal household devours more animals in 1 month than most villages see in a lifetime. But Henry doesn't just eat. He feasts. His favorite? Roasted venison, still dripping with fat. Wild boar, its skin crackling and dark. Swan, considered the most prestigious bird in England, reserved only for royalty. And stranger still, porpoise. Yes, porpoise. The peculiar Tudor belief was that because it lived in water, it counted as fish and could be eaten on fasting days. So Henry gorged on sea mammals, convincing himself he was being pious. Conger eel made regular appearances too. Massive, serpent-like creatures pulled from the depths, roasted whole, and served on silver platters longer than a man's arm. The texture was dense, oily, rich. Everything Henry craved. And vegetables? Those were for peasants. The Tudor court genuinely believed that raw fruits and vegetables were dangerous, even deadly. They thought these foods carried disease because they grew close to the ground where water often contaminated touched them. So the wealthiest people in England actively avoided the very foods that could have saved them. Instead, Henry consumed between 5,000 and 6,000 calories every single day. To put that in perspective, a modern active man needs about 2,500. Henry ate enough for 2 people, sometimes 3. And he did this day after day, year after year, decade after decade. The meat never stopped coming. Breakfast was meat. Dinner was meat. Late night snacks? More meat. His physicians noted his obsession, but no one dared tell the king to stop. You didn't question Henry VIII's appetite. Not if you valued your position. Not if you valued your head. The servants whispered among themselves. They saw the king's waistline expanding. They saw him breathing heavier after climbing stairs. But the orders remained the same. 13 dishes. Every meal. Roasted, boiled, baked, stewed. The flesh of every creature in England, sacrificed to satisfy one man's endless hunger. And this was just the beginning, because meat was only part of his deadly menu. But if the meat was Henry's obsession, sugar was his poison. Picture this. A banquet table at Greenwich Palace, 1520. The main courses have been cleared away. Now comes the final act, the subtleties. Servants carry in sculptures made entirely of sugar. A perfect replica of Hampton Court. Every window and tower carved from sweetened paste. A life-sized ship with working sails, painted in edible gold. A menagerie of animals, lions, dragons, unicorns, all gleaming white and deadly sweet. These weren't just decorations. Henry ate them. The centerpiece of Tudor desserts was marchpane, what we call marzipan today. Ground almonds mixed with sugar and rosewater, then baked until firm and coated with even more sugar icing, sometimes covered in gold leaf, sometimes silver. Always sickeningly sweet. Henry loved it. He consumed it at every feast, sometimes ordering entire banquets dedicated to sugar sculptures alone. Then came the jellies, 20 different varieties at major banquets. Not the simple fruit jellies we know today. These were elaborate creations flavored with exotic spices brought from the Far East. Cinnamon, ginger, saffron, all suspended in clarified sugar syrup, mixed with isinglass, a gelatin made from fish bladders. They shimmered on silver plates like jewels, and Henry devoured them methodically, one after another. His drink of choice for dessert? Hippocras? A spiced wine so heavily sweetened that it was more syrup than alcohol. Cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, all swimming in honey and sugar, mixed with the finest Burgundy wine. He drank it by the goblet, sometimes 3 or 4, in one sitting. Sugar was still relatively rare in the early 1500s, making it a status symbol. The more sugar you consumed, the wealthier you appeared. And Henry wanted everyone to know he was the wealthiest man in England. So he ate sugar like it was going out of fashion, which, for him, it never did. But sugar takes its revenge slowly. By his 40s, Henry's teeth had begun to rot. Court records mention his blackened teeth, a common affliction among the sugar-loving nobility. The pain must have been constant, yet he kept eating, kept drinking those honey-thick wines, kept demanding more marchpane, more jellies, more of everything sweet. What Henry didn't know, what no one in Tudor England could have known, was that sugar was doing something far worse than rotting his teeth. Modern researchers have analyzed Tudor diets and discovered something shocking. It wasn't the massive meat consumption that made Henry obese. It was the sugar and the refined carbohydrates from white bread. The meat, while excessive, wasn't the primary villain. The real killer was sitting there, in those beautiful sugar sculptures, in those glittering jellies, in those goblets of Hippocras. Every sweet bite was slowly destroying him from the inside out, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become his metabolic nightmare. And he had no idea. While sugar rotted him from within, Henry was washing it all down with an ocean of alcohol. 10 pints of ale, every single day. That was Henry's personal consumption, not counting wine. 10 pints. To understand the scale, that's roughly 160 ounces of liquid bread, as ale was known in Tudor England. Because that's exactly what it was: thick, calorie-dense, barely filtered, and strong enough to blur the edges of reality. The numbers across his palaces tell an even darker story. Hampton Court alone went through 600,000 gallons of ale annually. Add to that 75,000 gallons of wine. This wasn't just for Henry. It was for his entire court of over 1,000 people. But the king always drank more than anyone else. It was expected. It was tradition. It was killing him. The wine cellars beneath Hampton Court were architectural marvels of excess. Massive vaulted chambers stretching into darkness, lined with barrels from France, Spain, Italy, and Germany. Security was so tight that the cellar required 2 separate keys held by 2 different officials. Both had to be present. Both had to turn their keys simultaneously just to open the doors. What lay behind those doors? Enough wine to drown in. Henry's late-night drinking sessions became legendary and concerning. Foreign ambassadors wrote letters back to their kings describing how Henry's mood would shift dramatically after hours of wine consumption. Jovial and generous at dinner, he'd become unpredictable and volatile by midnight. The alcohol loosened his tongue and darkened his temperament. Decisions made drunk often led to executions made sober. But here's what made it truly lethal. Henry wasn't just drinking socially. He was self-medicating. As his body began failing him, as pain crept into his daily existence, he turned to ale and wine for relief. One Spanish ambassador noted that the king seemed to be compensating for his sufferings through excessive eating and drinking. The more he hurt, the more he drank. The more he drank, the more calories flooded his system. Each pint of Tudor ale contained roughly 200 calories. 10 pints meant 2,000 calories from ale alone before he touched a single piece of meat or marchpane. Add the wine, add the hippocras, and Henry was consuming thousands of liquid calories daily while believing he was simply staying hydrated and maintaining his status as a generous host. The cruel mathematics were simple. His body was taking in massive amounts of energy through drink while his activity levels were high. But that equation was about to change catastrophically. And when it did, all those liquid calories would turn from fuel into fat, from indulgence into imprisonment. The ale kept flowing, the wine kept pouring, and Henry kept drinking, unaware that every goblet was another nail in his coffin. Soon, something would happen that would rob him of the one thing that had kept this excess from destroying him completely: his ability to move. Henry's food and drink weren't just excessive, they were carefully designed to fail his body. From childhood, he had been taught that a proper royal diet meant meat, white bread, and drink, not plants. In Tudor thinking, fresh fruit and vegetables were suspicious, even dangerous. Anything raw, especially if it had touched unclean water, was believed to spread disease. So while peasants ate pottage, cabbage, onions, beans, and rough, fibrous bread, the king proudly avoided the very foods that might have protected his heart and arteries. At court, this wasn't seen as a risk. It was seen as refinement. Henry's table groaned under roasted beef, venison, richly baked pies, spiced sauces, soft white manchet bread, sugary marchpane, and jugs of ale and wine. Almost no fiber, almost no roughage. Day after day, his body was asked to process dense fat, protein, sugar, and alcohol with nothing to help it move through his system. The result was predictable, even if Tudor physicians couldn't fully understand it. Chronic constipation became one of his constant torments. Contemporary accounts and later medical analysis describe a king frequently unable to pass stool without great difficulty, sometimes going days without a proper movement. He suffered bloating, cramps, and straining that would have worsened the pressure on the blood vessels in his legs and abdomen. That same pressure, combined with his growing weight and long hours sitting in council, set the stage for something far worse: damaged blood flow in his lower body. Over time, the pattern hardened into a trap. The more uncomfortable he felt, the less he wanted to move. The less he moved, the slower his circulation became. The slower his circulation, the more likely it was that tiny injuries inside his blood vessels would fail to heal. What began as just constipation and heaviness after meals quietly pushed him toward vascular disease, the kind that later made his leg ulcers so stubborn and dangerous. Meanwhile, his physicians, working with the best knowledge of their time, didn't tell him to eat more greens or cut back on sugar. They often prescribed purgatives, enemas, and strange remedies to balance his humors, treating the symptoms rather than the cause. To them, meats signaled strength. Bread and wine signaled status. No one around Henry was prepared to say the unthinkable, that the king's glorious table was slowly sabotaging his organs. In a bitter twist, the poorest subjects in his realm, those forced to live on coarse grains and vegetables, often had more balanced diets than their monarch. Henry, surrounded by abundance, was quietly starving of the nutrients his body actually needed. His intestines, his blood vessels, his heart were all paying the price for a vision of royal luxury that confused excess with health. And then, in 1536, one catastrophic moment would take this already fragile system and push it over the edge, turning a dangerous lifestyle into a death sentence. January 24th, 1536. Greenwich Palace. The sky is gray, the air cold and sharp. In the tilt yard, Henry VIII prepares for another joust. At 44 years old, He's still competing, still proving himself. He's heavier than he was in his 20s. Yes, but he's the king. No one tells him to stop. No one suggests he's too old, too slow, too vulnerable. So he climbs onto his warhorse, servants straining to hoist him into the saddle. The full suit of armor alone weighs nearly 100 pounds. Beneath it, Henry is sweating. The opponent charges. Lances lower, hooves thunder across frozen ground. Then impact. The lance strikes Henry squarely. He's knocked backward, losing his grip, tilting in the saddle. For a moment, everything slows. Then he falls, armored, off balance, crashing toward the earth. And the horse, a 1,200-pound warhorse in full momentum, loses its footing and comes down directly on top of him. The crowd goes silent. Servants sprint across the tiltyard. They reach the king and find him motionless, trapped beneath the weight of the animal. It takes several men to pull the horse off. Henry doesn't respond. His eyes are closed, his breathing shallow. 2 hours pass. For 2 hours, Henry VIII lies unconscious. Courtiers panic. Messengers are dispatched. Plans are whispered in dark corridors about succession, about what happens if he doesn't wake up. Anne Boleyn, pregnant with their child, is told the news. The shock will later be blamed for her miscarriage days after. But Henry does wake up. When his eyes finally open, he's confused, disoriented, in pain. His head throbs. His left leg, the same leg that had an old injury from a jousting accident 9 years earlier, in 1527, is screaming in agony. That old wound, which had mostly healed, has been ripped open again by the crushing weight of the horse. Before this moment, Henry was active. Not as athletic as his youth, but still riding, still hunting, still dancing at court. He prided himself on being a warrior king, a sportsman, a man of action. This was part of his identity, woven into how he saw himself and how others saw him. After this moment, everything changed. The man who woke up in that tiltyard was different. Not just physically, though the damage to his leg would prove catastrophic, but something else shifted too. Ambassadors would later write that the king seemed greatly altered after the accident. His moods darkened. His patience shortened. Whether it was the head trauma, the constant pain, or the sudden realization of his own mortality, Henry was never quite the same. He didn't know it yet, but this fall had just sentenced him to a slow, agonizing decline. The active life that had kept his excessive diet from destroying him, gone, and his body was about to pay the price. Within weeks of the accident, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. The injury to Henry's left thigh refused to close. At first, his physicians thought it would heal as it had before, back in 1527, when the original wound eventually scarred over. But this time was different. The trauma from the horse crushing his leg had damaged something deeper, the veins themselves. What developed were varicose ulcers, open sores caused by poor blood circulation in his legs. As blood pooled and pressure built in the damaged veins, the skin broke down, creating wounds that wept constantly. Clear fluid, then yellowish discharge, seeped through the bandages day and night. The ulcers weren't just on his left leg anymore. Soon, his right leg developed them too, and they never closed. For the remaining 11 years of his life, Henry VIII lived with open, weeping wounds on both legs. Physicians tried everything known to Tudor medicine. They applied poultices made from herbs. They used ointments containing ground pearls, supposedly healing compounds, even powdered unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk, sold at extraordinary prices. Nothing worked. The ulcers would occasionally seem to improve, scabbing over slightly, giving false hope. Then they'd burst open again, sometimes without warning. When that happened, the pain was so intense that Henry would be bedridden for days, unable to stand the pressure of his own weight on his legs. But worse than the pain was the smell. Infected tissue produces a distinctive odor, sweet, rotten, unmistakable. As the ulcers became chronically infected, that smell followed Henry everywhere. Servants noticed it. Courtiers noticed it. Foreign ambassadors, in private letters, mentioned the stench emanating from the king's chambers. No amount of perfume or incense could fully mask it. His physicians had to drain the legs regularly. Using primitive instruments, they would relieve the built-up fluid and infected material, a process that must have been excruciating. There were no anesthetics, no antibiotics, no understanding of sterilization. Each draining risked introducing more infection, yet leaving the pressure to build was equally dangerous. The cycle became relentless. Infection, swelling, draining, brief relief, then infection again. Henry's legs were battlegrounds where his body fought itself, and his body was losing. Medical historians now believe Henry suffered from chronic venous insufficiency, a condition where damaged veins can't properly return blood from the legs to the heart. Combined with his increasing weight and immobility, this created the perfect environment for ulcers that would never heal. In modern times, compression therapy, antibiotics, and sometimes surgery can manage such wounds. In 1536, there was nothing. So the wounds stayed open, the infections kept returning, and the smell of decay became part of the royal presence. Henry's leg ulcers weren't just painful, they were humiliating. A constant, visible reminder that the mighty king was rotting while still alive. And soon, they would trap him in ways far worse than pain alone. The ulcers didn't just hurt, they imprisoned him. Before 1536, Henry's life had been defined by movement. He hunted for hours, riding through forests chasing deer and boar. He jousted in tournaments, competing against younger men and often winning. He danced at court banquets, spinning partners across the floor until dawn. He walked his gardens, inspected his ships, traveled between palaces. His physicality was part of his power. Now, standing was agony. Walking was nearly impossible. By 1540, just 4 years after the accident, Henry required a specially designed chair to move around his palaces. Servants carried him everywhere upstairs, down corridors, into council chambers. The chair itself was a mechanical marvel for its time, a sedan contraption that required 4 strong men to lift. But it was also a cage. Hunting? Finished. The last time he tried, the pain in his legs became so unbearable he had to be carried back to the palace mid-hunt, humiliated in front of his courtiers. Jousting? Never again. Dancing? He could barely stand through a banquet, let alone dance. Even walking from his bedchamber to the throne room became an ordeal that left him breathless and sweating. Here's where the trap closed completely. Henry was still eating exactly as he had before, the same 5,000 to 6,000 calories daily, the same 13 dishes per meal, the same ale, wine, sugar sculptures, and roasted meats. But now he was burning almost nothing. An active man his size might have needed those calories. A sedentary man did not. The mathematics were brutal. Every excess calorie his body couldn't burn was stored as fat. Every week he gained weight. Every month his body expanded. And every pound he gained made movement even more painful, which made him move even less, which made him gain more weight. It was a death spiral, and he couldn't escape it. Modern doctors understand this pattern well. Immobility is one of the worst things for venous ulcers. The leg muscles help pump blood back up to the heart. Without movement, blood pools, pressure builds, and wounds can't heal. Henry's refusal to move wasn't just about pain avoidance. It was actively making his condition worse. But there was something else happening too, something his physicians couldn't see. Extended immobility, especially in someone overweight with poor circulation, dramatically increases the risk of blood clots forming in the deep veins of the legs. Those clots can break free, travel through the bloodstream, and lodge in the lungs or brain. Fatal in seconds. Henry was sitting on a medical time bomb, and every day he spent in that chair wound it tighter. Yet through it all, the feasts continued. The platters kept coming, because if he couldn't move like a king, couldn't fight like a king, couldn't dance or hunt or joust like a king, he could at least still eat like one. Food became his last remaining pleasure, even as it destroyed him faster than any enemy ever could. But the accident didn't just break his body. Something in his mind shifted too. People who knew Henry before 1536 and after spoke of two different men. In his youth and early reign, he could be generous, even merciful. He enjoyed music, wrote poetry, engaged in theological debates. Yes, he was proud and temperamental, but there was balance. He laughed. He forgave. He showed moments of genuine kindness. After the fall, that balance disappeared. The executions increased. His paranoia deepened. His rage became unpredictable and terrifying. Within months of the accident, Anne Boleyn was arrested and beheaded. Over the next decade, the list grew longer. Thomas Cromwell, Catherine Howard, dozens of nobles, monks, and courtiers. Some deserved their fates by the standards of the time. Many didn't, but all faced a king whose capacity for mercy seemed to have died in that tilt-yard. Foreign ambassadors began noting the change in their letters home. One wrote that Henry had become greatly altered since the accident. Another described him as increasingly difficult to predict, swinging between charm and cold fury within hours. The French ambassador mentioned that approaching the king uncertain, days felt like walking toward a caged animal. You never knew if he'd be calm or strike. Was it the head injury? Henry had been unconscious for 2 hours after his skull struck the ground. Modern doctors know that traumatic brain injuries can alter personality, increase aggression, and reduce impulse control. It's entirely possible that Henry suffered damage to his frontal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for judgment and emotional regulation. Or was it the pain? Chronic, unrelenting pain changes people. It wears down patience. It makes everything else seem trivial. When you're living with constant agony, other people's problems matter less. Their lives matter less. Henry was in pain every single day for 11 years. That kind of suffering doesn't build character, it erodes it. Some historians argue it was neither injury nor pain, but humiliation. Henry had built his identity on being a warrior king, a Renaissance prince, a man of action. Now he was trapped in a chair, helpless, dependent on servants to move him from room to room. For a man whose ego was as large as his kingdom, that loss of power over his own body may have been unbearable. So he compensated by exerting absolute power over everyone else. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. The man who fell in 1536 was not the man who stood up afterward. His body was rotting from infected ulcers. His mind was darkening from trauma and torment. And his diet, that endless parade of meat, sugar, and alcohol, was now working unopposed. Without movement to burn it away, without physical outlet for his frustration, every meal was another step closer to complete collapse. The king was eating himself to death, and he was taking his rage out on everyone around him. While Henry's wounds rotted on the outside, something far more sinister was happening inside. His body was drowning in sugar, not just from the marchpane and jellies, but from the constant stream of refined carbohydrates, white bread, sugary wines, sweetened sauces. For years, his pancreas had been working overtime, pumping out insulin to process the relentless flood of glucose. But eventually, the system began to fail. Modern medical historians studying Henry's documented symptoms believe he almost certainly developed type 2 diabetes in his later years. The signs were all there. Unquenchable thirst, documented by servants who noted his constant demands for drink. Extreme fatigue, which his courtiers attributed to his weight, but was likely something deeper. And most tellingly, wounds that refused to heal. Diabetes is a silent saboteur. High blood sugar damages blood vessels throughout the body, particularly in the extremities. It slows healing, thickens blood, and starves tissues of oxygen. For someone already suffering from venous ulcers, diabetes would have been catastrophic. Every time Henry's leg wounds showed signs of closing, his elevated blood sugar would undermine the healing process, keeping the wounds open and vulnerable to infection. But the damage wasn't limited to his legs. His waistline told its own story. In his 20s, Henry had a 32-inch waist. Court records show he was athletic, trim, impressive. By 1540, tailors were measuring him at 52 inches. 20 inches of expansion in 2 decades. His doublets had to be redesigned every few months as his belly pushed outward, straining against fabric and leather. Portraits from his later years show the transformation starkly. His face, once sharp and handsome, became rounded and heavy. His neck thickened until it nearly disappeared into his shoulders. His body, once the envy of Europe, became something courtiers tried not to stare at. By the time of his death in 1547, Henry weighed approximately 350 pounds. For context, that's over 25 stone. Carrying that weight on a 6'2" frame was hard enough. Carrying it on legs riddled with infected ulcers was torture. The weight pressed down on those wounds constantly, preventing circulation, increasing pressure in already damaged veins. Every step, when he could still take them, was like walking on broken glass. Eventually, even standing became impossible. The flesh of his legs, crushed under his own mass, simply gave up trying to repair itself. His physicians had no concept of diabetes. They didn't understand insulin resistance or metabolic syndrome. They saw a fat king with bad legs and treated the symptoms with poultices and prayers. They never connected his diet to his deteriorating condition, because in their understanding, rich food was supposed to make you strong. Meat meant vitality. Sugar meant wealth and refinement. So Henry kept eating, kept gaining weight, kept pushing his body toward complete metabolic collapse. And his pancreas, exhausted from decades of abuse, slowly stopped being able to protect him from his own appetite. The sugar that had tasted so sweet was now pure poison in his veins. The weight crushing his legs was only part of the problem. Inside his chest, his heart was struggling to survive. Imagine trying to pump blood through a body that had nearly doubled in size. Henry's heart, which had once powered an athletic frame through hours of hunting and jousting, was now responsible for feeding 350 pounds of flesh. Every beat had to push blood through miles of additional vessels, through layers of fat, through damaged and narrowed arteries. His diet had been clogging those arteries for decades. The endless parade of fatty meats, the alcohol, the complete absence of anything that could have protected his cardiovascular system, it all added up. Modern analysis of Tudor royal diets suggests that someone eating as Henry did would have had catastrophically high cholesterol. His blood vessels would have been lined with plaque, narrowing the pathways, forcing his heart to work even harder to push blood through. High blood pressure was inevitable. Though Tudor physicians had no way to measure it, the signs were visible. Court records mention his reddened face, especially after eating or drinking, his shortness of breath, even at rest, the way he'd suddenly become flushed with rage during council meetings, his face turning purple. These weren't just symptoms of anger. They were symptoms of a cardiovascular system on the verge of collapse. Some historians believe Henry may have suffered minor strokes in his final years. There are references to him having episodes of confusion, moments where he seemed disoriented or couldn't recall conversations from hours earlier. His handwriting, once elegant, became shaky and difficult to read. These could have been small blockages in his brain, tiny disasters that went undiagnosed because no one understood what they were witnessing. His lungs were failing too. Carrying that much weight compressed his diaphragm, making it harder to draw full breaths. He wheezed constantly. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and shallow, possibly complicated by what we'd now recognize as sleep apnea. His body was starving for oxygen even while he slept, putting additional strain on his already overworked heart. Every system was connected, every problem making the others worse. The immobility thickened his blood. The thickened blood increased clot risk. The clots threatened his brain and lungs. The weight stressed his heart. The stressed heart raised his blood pressure. The high blood pressure damaged his kidneys. Round and round, a cascade of failures with no way to stop it. In his final year, physicians noted he was often breathless, even when sitting still. His skin had taken on a grayish tint. His extremities, fingers, and toes were sometimes cold to the touch, a sign of poor circulation. His body was shutting down piece by piece, organ by organ, and still he ate. Because what else could he do? He couldn't walk away from his pain, couldn't exercise it away, couldn't escape the prison his body had become. Food was all he had left. Even as it destroyed him, it was the only comfort remaining. His heart, quite literally, couldn't take much more. Here's the darkest irony of all. Henry VIII, the wealthiest man in England, surrounded by more food than most people saw in a lifetime, was starving. Not in the way peasants starved from lack of food. Henry was starving from abundance. His body was drowning in calories, but desperately lacking in the nutrients it actually needed to function. Think about what he never ate. Fresh fruits almost never touched his plate. Vegetables actively avoided as peasant food. Leafy greens, root vegetables, legumes, anything fibrous or raw, considered beneath royal dignity or potentially dangerous. His diet was a nutritional wasteland, despite being a caloric excess. The consequences were severe. Without vitamin C from fresh produce, he risked scurvy. While full-blown scurvy was rare among the wealthy, subclinical deficiency would have weakened his blood vessels, made his gums bleed, and slowed wound healing even further. His ulcers, already struggling to close, were being sabotaged by a diet that couldn't provide the basic building blocks for tissue repair. His bones were probably weakening too. Despite consuming dairy and sauces and cheeses, the lack of vitamin D, which requires sunlight exposure combined with his increasing immobility, meant his skeleton was under siege. A man who once jousted and hunted was now at risk of fractures from simply shifting weight in his chair. His immune system, starved of the antioxidants and vitamins found in plants, couldn't fight infections effectively. This is why his leg ulcers became chronically infected, and why those infections kept returning. His body lacked the tools to mount a proper defense. Meanwhile, the poorest laborers in his kingdom were eating better than he was in many ways. Their rough brown bread contained far more fiber and nutrients than his refined white banchet. Their pottage a thick stew of oats, beans, onions, and whatever vegetables were available provided sustained energy and essential vitamins. Their occasional access to apples, cabbage, and root vegetables gave them compounds that protected their hearts and blood vessels. They were surviving on what Henry considered garbage, and they were, in many cases, healthier for it. Tudor physicians didn't understand nutrition in these terms. They worked with the theory of humors, balancing hot and cold, wet and dry. They believed meat was hot and strengthening, while vegetables were cold and weakening. So when Henry showed signs of illness, they often prescribed more meat, more wine, more of exactly what was killing him. It was medical advice delivered with complete confidence and utter ignorance. Every recommendation pushed him further into the trap. Henry had the resources to eat anything in the known world. Spices from Asia, wines from France, fish from distant seas, exotic birds, rare delicacies. He could have demanded fresh salads, fruit orchards, vegetable gardens, cultivated specifically for his table. But he didn't, because in his world, those foods represented weakness and poverty. So the richest man in England ate himself into malnutrition, his body betrayed not by scarcity, but by a twisted vision of what strength and status should look like on a plate. Henry's physicians knew he was dying. They just had no idea how to stop it. Tudor medicine was a strange mix of observation, tradition, and superstition. Doctors could see the symptoms clearly: the infected legs, the labored breathing, the expanding waistline, the chronic pain. What they couldn't see was the cause. They had no understanding of bacteria, no concept of metabolic disease, no knowledge of how diet directly shaped health outcomes. So they tried everything their training and desperation could conjure. For the leg ulcers, they applied poultices made from crushed herbs, mixed with wine and oils. When those failed, they turned to stranger remedies. Ground pearls believed to have cooling properties. Powdered unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk imported at astronomical cost, which was thought to draw out poison. They even applied mixtures containing gold, reasoning that such a precious metal must carry healing power. None of it worked. The ulcers continued weeping, continued festering, continued destroying his legs inch by inch. The draining procedures were particularly grim. Using metal instruments that would horrify modern surgeons, physicians would pierce the swollen tissue to release built-up fluid and infected material. There was no sterilization. The tools were wiped clean at best, used on multiple patients, often introducing new infections even as they tried to treat existing ones. And there was no anesthesia, no morphine, no way to numb the pain. Henry had to endure these procedures fully conscious, feeling every cut, every drainage, every moment of excruciating pressure release. His only option was to drink heavily beforehand and grip the arms of his chair while servants held him down. His doctors did recognize that his diet was extreme. Several wrote cautiously worded letters, suggesting he might benefit from eating less meat and drinking less wine. But they framed it in terms of balancing humors, not because they understood cardiovascular disease or diabetes. And critically, they never suggested he was eating too much, just that he might need different types of excess. When he complained of constipation, they gave him purgatives and enemas that left him weakened and dehydrated. When his heart raced and his face flushed, they bled him, draining blood in the mistaken belief it would balance his system. Every treatment made things worse while appearing, to them, to be medically sound. The tragedy is that even basic knowledge could have helped him. If they'd understood infection, simple cleanliness might have prevented some of his leg complications. If they'd known about nutrition, encouraging fruits and vegetables could have strengthened his immune system. If they'd grasped the connection between immobility and circulation, they might have insisted he move more despite the pain. Instead, they worked in darkness, brilliant men applying flawed science to a dying king. And Henry, trapped between unbearable pain and useless medicine, had only one reliable escape left: food. The very thing destroying him was also the only pleasure he could still control. So he kept eating, kept drinking, kept demanding those 13 dishes per meal. His doctors could do nothing but watch as their king slowly consumed himself to death. By 1540, Henry VIII was no longer a king. He was a prisoner inside a dying body. Every morning began the same way. Servants entered his bedchamber and helped lift him from bed, a process that required at least 4 men. His legs, wrapped in stained bandages from the night's leakage, could no longer support his weight. Even attempting to stand sent waves of pain through his body that left him gasping. The specially built chair waited nearby. Wooden, reinforced, padded, but still a cage. They lowered him into it, careful not to jostle his legs. Then came the procession, 4 servants lifting the chair, carrying the king wherever he needed to go, through corridors he'd once walked freely, past rooms where he'd once danced, into council chambers where he now sat, elevated but helpless. The smell preceded him everywhere. Despite the physicians changing his bandages twice daily, despite the herbs packed into the dressings, despite the incense burned in his chambers, the odor of infected flesh was inescapable. It clung to the air around him, a constant reminder that parts of him were rotting while he still lived. His courtiers learned to control their expressions. You didn't flinch when the king entered a room, even if the smell made your stomach turn. You didn't stare at his bandaged legs, now swollen to nearly twice their normal size. You didn't comment on how his face had become a mask of barely controlled agony. The infections came in cycles. Sometimes the ulcers would stabilize for a few weeks, giving hope. Henry would seem brighter, more engaged, almost like his old self. Then, without warning, one would burst open again. Fever would grip him. He'd be confined to bed for days, sometimes weeks, as his body fought battles it could no longer win. During these episodes, he became delirious. Servants reported him shouting at people who weren't there, reliving old arguments, calling out names of wives long dead. The fevers cooked his brain, and in those moments, the carefully maintained facade of royal dignity crumbled completely. Yet even bedridden, even half-conscious with fever, the feasts continued. Kitchen staff received orders for elaborate meals, even when Henry was too sick to eat them. It was as if stopping the food would be admitting defeat, acknowledging that his body was truly failing. When he could eat, he did so with the same intensity as always. Servants would bring platters to his bedside, propping him up with pillows. He'd tear into roasted meat with his hands, juice running down his chin, eating not from hunger, but from something deeper defiance, perhaps, or desperation. The court watched in horror and pity. This was their king. The man who'd once been the envy of Europe, who'd composed music and written theology, who'd commanded respect through strength and charisma. Now he was this suffering, immobile, decaying figure who smelled of death and still demanded 13 dishes. The decay was no longer hidden. It was the king's defining feature, and everyone knew how this story would end. Even as his body surrendered, his hunger never did. There is something deeply unsettling about watching someone eat themselves, toward oblivion while fully aware of what is happening. And Henry knew. His physicians had told him, as carefully as they dared, that his diet might be contributing to his suffering. His closest advisers had suggested, in whispers, that perhaps smaller meals might ease his discomfort. He wasn't stupid. He could feel his body failing with every meal. But he couldn't stop. Food had become more than sustenance. It was control. When everything else had been taken from him, his mobility, his athletic prowess, his ability to hunt or fight or dance, food remained. He could still command a feast. He could still decide what was served, when it arrived, how much of it there was. In a life that had narrowed to the confines of a chair and a sickbed, eating was the last arena where he held absolute power. It was also comfort. Psychologists now understand that chronic pain often leads to emotional eating. The temporary pleasure of taste, the distraction of a meal, the brief dopamine hit from sugar and fat, these became Henry's medicine when real medicine failed him. Each bite was a momentary escape from the constant burning in his legs, the crushing weight of his own body, the humiliation of his dependence. So even when he was too weak to sit up properly, servants brought the dishes. Propped against pillows, struggling to breathe, he'd still reach for the platters. The roasted meats might go cold before he finished them now. The elaborate sugar sculptures might sit untouched. But they had to be there. The ritual mattered even when the appetite faltered. Kitchen records from his final years show something chilling. The orders never decreased. Even as Henry ate less, he demanded the same volume of food prepared. 13 dishes at every meal, whether he could finish them or not. The waste must have been staggering, but no one questioned it. To reduce the order would be to acknowledge the king was dying. His attendants watched this psychological spiral with growing dread. They saw how his eyes lit up when food arrived, even when he barely had strength to chew. They noticed how he'd become agitated if meals were delayed, almost panicked, as if the food itself was keeping him alive rather than killing him. In a way, it was both. The act of eating gave him something to live for, even as the food itself shortened his life. It was his last pleasure and his final poison, impossibly tangled together. There's a special kind of tragedy in watching someone cling to the very thing destroying them, knowing they know, knowing they can't stop. knowing that beneath the royal robes and the crown and the power, there's just a man terrified of losing the last thing that still feels like living. And so the feasts continued, right up until the very end, in a palace that smelled of decay and rang with the king's labored breathing. The final days came in winter, cold and gray, fitting for what was about to unfold. By mid-January 1547, Henry knew. He'd survived infection after infection, crisis after crisis, but this time felt different. His breathing had become shallow, rattling. His skin, once flushed red from high blood pressure, had turned pale and waxy. He was 55 years old, but his body was ancient, worn down by decades of excess and 11 years of unhealed wounds. His physicians moved around him quietly, their faces grim. They'd done everything they could, everything their knowledge allowed. Now they could only wait and watch as the king's systems failed one by one. The leg ulcers had reached their final, terrible stage. Medical historians now believe that in those last days, a blood clot likely formed in one of his damaged leg veins. After years of poor circulation, immobility, and chronic infection, his blood had become thick and slow. A clot breaking free from his leg could have traveled upward through his veins, reaching his lungs or heart within seconds. A pulmonary embolism, silent, swift, fatal. Or perhaps it was his heart that simply gave out, exhausted from years of pumping blood through a body too large, through vessels too narrow. Or his lungs, compressed and weakened, finally unable to draw another breath. Or the accumulated infections, overwhelming what remained of his immune system. In truth, it was probably all of these things at once. His body wasn't failing from one cause. It was collapsing from dozens of interconnected catastrophes that had been building for decades. On January 28th, in the early hours before dawn, Henry VIII died at Whitehall Palace. The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. The most powerful man in England was gone, but the body remained, and it presented an immediate problem. Henry's corpse weighed 350 pounds. Moving it required planning, equipment, multiple strong men. They wrapped him in lead to seal in the body, and the smell. Even in death, the infected ulcers continued to leak, and the odor had become overwhelming in the closed chamber. Getting the body to Windsor Castle for burial was a logistical nightmare. The casket, reinforced to hold his weight, had to be carried by over a dozen pallbearers working in shifts. And according to some accounts, disputed by historians, but persistent in legend, the casket began to leak during transport, the king's body literally breaking down faster than the lead could contain it. When they finally lowered him into his tomb at St. George's Chapel, next to Jane Seymour, his third wife, and the only one he truly mourned, it must have felt like closing a chapter on a cautionary tale. Henry VIII, King of England, defender of the faith, supreme head of the church, a man who'd shaped an entire nation's religious and political landscape, dead at 55, killed by his own fork, by choices made at countless banquets that had seemed, in the moment, like triumphs rather than surrender. History remembers Henry VIII not as the athletic prince who once impressed Europe, but as the bloated tyrant who couldn't control his appetites. That's the cruelest legacy of all. Everything else he accomplished, breaking from Rome, establishing the Church of England, expanding royal power, shaping the Tudor dynasty, gets overshadowed by the image of a grotesque, immobile king eating himself to death. His diet didn't just kill his body, it killed his reputation. Modern medical analysis of his life reveals something fascinating and tragic. If Henry had simply eaten differently, the entire course of English history might have changed. His personality shift after 1536, which led to increased executions and political instability, was likely driven by chronic pain and possible brain injury. Better nutrition might have helped his wounds heal. Movement might have prevented the ulcers from becoming chronic. A different diet could have kept him active, sharp, and perhaps even merciful. The irony cuts deeper when you look at what was actually destroying him. For centuries, people assumed it was the meat, all those oxen and sheep and wild boar. But modern nutritional science tells a different story. The real killers were the sugar and refined carbohydrates, the marchpane, the white bread, the sweetened wines, the jellies. These were spiking his blood sugar, triggering insulin resistance, promoting fat storage, and accelerating his cardiovascular decline. If he'd eaten like his peasants, round bread with fiber, vegetables, less sugar, simpler meals, he might have lived into his 70s. Imagine a Henry VIII who ruled for another 15 years. More children, perhaps. Different marriages. Different political decisions made without the fog of constant pain and deteriorating mental state. But he couldn't see it. To him, vegetables were poverty. Sugar was status. Meat was strength. His entire worldview about food was exactly backward, and it cost him decades of life. There's a haunting lesson buried in Henry's story that resonates across centuries. Unlimited wealth and power couldn't save him from his own choices. He could execute anyone who displeased him, could reshape religion to suit his needs, could command armies and navies. But he couldn't command his body to heal, couldn't force his legs to stop rotting, couldn't wish away the consequences of decades of excess. The poorest laborer in his kingdom, eating rough bread and cabbage, living in a cottage with a dirt floor, probably had healthier arteries and a stronger heart than the King of England in his silk-draped bed. In the end, Henry VIII became exactly what he feared most: helpless, dependent, pitied. His body, which he'd adorned in jewels and fine cloth, became a prison more secure than any he'd built for his enemies. And the food he'd used to demonstrate his power became the weapon that destroyed him from within. He died as he lived, excessively, dramatically, and completely avoidably. A king who had everything except the one thing that might have saved him: the wisdom to know when enough was enough.